Film of the week.
Okay, so this week we watched and reviewed Blade Runner 2049, the sequel to the original Blade Runner film released in the 1980s, which had Harrison Ford in it. So this updated version, it still has Harrison Ford, but our main protagonist has changed now to Ryan Gosling. Harry, why don't you just give us a rough overview of the plot of the film, just so people that haven't seen it get an idea of what we're talking about?
Yes, keeping it fairly vague, still make it interesting. You're following a younger Blade Runner. Blade Runners being people that hunt down. Essentially, you would call them androids, wouldn't you? Human. They're called replicants to make sure they don't get out and essentially do things without being controlled to do that. Played by Ryan Gosling, who sort of essentially finds a secret that turns the world upside down, cliche, but slightly more subtle than that. As well as trying to find Harrison Ford, who's been missing for about 40 years up till now. This all being set in the year 2049, as the title suggests.
Yeah, so we're kind of in like a... There's hints to like an event which kind of caused a big reset in terms of humanity. And these androids kind of, there's a debate on whether they're real people or not, because that line has started to get blurred because they're so realistic. But there's a potential uprising of older models that have their own like opinions and thoughts about how they should be treated, not just as slave labor. So, Rory, what were your kind of initial thoughts? Why don't we start with maybe the acting? Obviously, Ryan Gosling plays the main character, but a few big actors in this as well. What did you think?
I thought the acting in this film was overall pretty good. I thought there weren't many times where kind of characters said stuff that I thought that really doesn't suit who they're trying to kind of portray. I think it's kind of easy with Harrison Ford. Obviously, he doesn't come into the film. He's not in the entire film, but I thought he's a bit of a character actor at this point. You kind of know what you're going to get, and I thought he kind of revived an older version of his old character really well. That's not too much of a spoiler, is it?
Nah, that's fine.
No. Yeah, and then elsewhere, I think Ryan Gosling did a great job. I think, again, you know what you're getting with Ryan Gosling. He's kind of got that moody vacantness about him, but I thought the bits of emotion you do see are quite cool, and they're quite few and far between, where he kind of have like outbursts of emotion. But no, I thought he was a really compelling actor. And then someone who I'm starting to kind of notice is Ana de Armas. Horrible pronunciation considering I do speak Spanish.
Yeah, a bit wobbly.
No, so I saw her in Knives Out and I thought she was great. And seeing her in this now, I know they came out in the opposite order, but yeah, seeing her in this now, I thought she did a really good job, especially kind of representing that uncertainty between human and artificial intelligence. I thought that was a really interesting character, and to be honest, in the entire film, I think the interactions between her character Joy and Kay, Ryan Gosling's character, were some of my favourite moments, especially for the kind of messages that they put into or the kind of questions they put into your head. I enjoyed those the most.
Yeah, no, I agree. So this is a question for both of you, from someone that isn't as involved in the film industry, like I say, every single week. Ryan Gosling's obviously a really well-known actor and he's in quite a lot of films. Would you say he's considered by reviewers or the industry in general, he's actually a good actor? Because from what I've seen of him in La La Land or Driver, he's like, I've always been impressed with his performance, but because he's so well-known, it's difficult sometimes to actually know if objectively he is a good actor or not. Harry, what do you think?
I'm a big fan of Ryan Gosling, but weirdly, I think he hovers on the cusp of being as good as the project he's in. Does that make sense? I don't feel like he's an actor people are going to go out their way and say, it's not like a Leo DiCaprio where you're going, he is bigger than the film itself. He plays his roles, and I will say this for nearly all of them, really, really well. I've seen a lot of Ryan Gosling films. Drive's one of my favourite films. I've seen, Place Beyond the Pines, all these other ones, and he plays all of them really, really well. But I don't feel like he's ever someone who gets, he doesn't get tons of like nominations for awards or anything like that. And he's always a leading man. He very rarely plays supporting roles. But he doesn't ever seem to put a foot wrong. I'm a big fan of Ryan Gosling, and to be honest, the rest of this cast. Even people that I'm less sure of, like Dave Bautista, it's almost a cameo, his role, but I think he's really good in it.
Yeah, I was surprised. The one thing I would say is Ryan Gosling beating Dave Bautista in a fight at the start of the film. Is that going to happen in real life? Oh, is that a spoiler?
Not really happens in the first 5 minutes. But
we can leave it in. I agree with everything you've said, Harry. I agree with everything you've said, Harry, and I think his acting is so good that you kind of, the plaudits almost go to his character rather than him himself. I think he does really well with well-written lines, and he does really well in kind of fitting into the... His character's never going to change that much. I think a lot of his characters are quite similar in the way they hold themselves, the way they express themselves. So I don't think that's ever going to change that much. Maybe his range isn't good enough to earn those nominations, but I think the way he executes the script, the action a lot of the time, I think is really good. So yeah, I liked Ryan Gosling. I think the problem maybe early in his career is that he was put into this category of, like, I think he was world's sexiest man or something.
He got rom-com, didn't he?
Once that tag gets put on you, once that tag gets put on you, it does become a bit of an issue. But I think he's done well to put out some really good performances.
We've all been there.
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say, I agree. Like we've put forward a case for him being really good, and I think his performance is good in this film. I think the role that he played again, it was in his favor a little bit. I think if I had one criticism of his performance, it kind of was that I didn't see a lot of like the happy emotions or like joy. But being the nature that he was, he's supposed to be this kind of like android character robot in the film. Maybe that probably helped because he didn't really have to portray those kind of emotions. I think the idea was that, especially at the start of the film, he was very much robotic and kind of going through the motions of life, and he didn't really need to enjoy it because of the nature of what he was. But when he started to develop through the film and things change, it might have been nice to see that reflected a bit more in facial expressions and trying to portray emotion a bit more in his character. But overall, pretty successful.
I mean, I'd say what makes Blade Runner a better film than it could have been, than other people may have made it, is almost the people behind the scenes rather than those you see on screen. So if you look at, director Denis Villeneuve, he has got such a mad repertoire of films at the moment. He's got Dune coming out next year, which is possibly the biggest film since Tenet came out. He's done Prisoners, Arrival, Sicario, and this, all films that have got Oscars nominations left and right. And then you go to the music and the cinematography, and you've got Hans Zimmer doing all the sounds with Benjamin Wallfisch, who between them have so many good films, it's disgusting. And then Roger Deakins doing the cinematography, who's the guy behind things like 1917, Skyfall, No Country for Old Men, Shawshank Redemption. They have got an obscene amount of talent behind the screen that makes this look, because as films go, this looks and sounds as good as almost anything else you see out there. My comparison for this is Interstellar, purely because they've got these sci-fi elements with big budget and a lot of things, going for them in terms of complex plots and length and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd say this looks and sounds almost as good as Interstellar, and I think Interstellar is the best looking and sounding film I've ever seen. Some of the environments when they're in the desert sort of areas, or when it's snowing, or when they're properly in the grottier sort of parts of town, just looks and sounds so sort of dystopian, cyberpunky future. It's what you want to see and hear when you watch this sort of film, without being oppressed by sort of sloppy CGI and sets that look a little bit budget and some overused techniques that are all too prevalent in films today.
Yeah, they do a really good job of, we're in 2049, we're kind of in this, it's not post-apocalyptic, we've not had that kind of event, but it's very much a depressing state of the world. And I think particularly the use of lighting and shadows is so good when we kind of are in those kind of scenes. But then as well, the use of color, there's if you've seen the film, you'll know when we're in a different location, there's a significant use of color, and I just thought all of the scenes in that part of the film were just so beautiful. And again, with the neon signs and the futuristic sci-fi kind of element of this film, it really lends itself to, implementing that kind of stuff in film. And it's nice to actually see that someone's taken that challenge on and they've actually executed it really well.
My one sort of foible is the word I'm going to use.
That's a nice word.
With this film is that at the runtime, which is, it's what, 2.5, getting on for 3 hours. It's a long film, but I'm fine with that. Is that it is hard to follow. Now, if you haven't seen the first Blade Runner, I sympathise, because it's 40 years old and might be a film that you're just not that bothered about. I wasn't initially. I have seen it. It is a good film. However, if you go into this having not seen that, things are even more complex than they almost need to be. I feel like they could have clarified things a bit nicer for those people that don't know. When you say the name Deckard, that immediately you're talking about Harrison Ford, because you can see Harrison Ford, you know what you're hearing about, but there's no frame of reference, there's nothing like that. Or even some of the speech is just quite hard to follow in terms of it's whispered or it's nuanced in a way that's great if you're so invested in the Blade Runner franchise and you love Philip K. Dick and all the books he's written or whatever. But if you're someone coming in as a film appreciator, but not someone who necessarily loves the lore and the background of this film, it is a tough watch. Like, it fundamentally is hard to understand. I've seen this film 3 times now, with about 2 or 3 years in between from the first watch to the most recent one, and it's still tricky to follow. I still need the wiki up, so I can vaguely check who's talking about who and what the plot's doing. But I want to like it, but when a plot is obstructive to me understanding and fully appreciating a film, that is a big problem for me. And that's why this film for me is just good. It's not great.
I think it's a really interesting point of discussion when we talk about runtime, because we talked about it I think maybe in the last podcast, but that complexity is okay when you're at 2 hours. When you get to 2 3/4 hours, you've got the complexity, you've got several bits of like plot that start to fall off.
Yeah.
And you've got, as kind of visually appealing and grabbing as it might be, you do start to kind of lose yourself in the complexity, and you see certain things and you're like, how long is this going to go on for like this? Like, this could just go on forever. And you get a couple of plot holes and you're like, what's actually going to happen by the end of this film?
And it's taxing, isn't it? It's the same way I felt about Tenet. I'm watching this for 2.5 hours. You've got to give me the time to almost process some of the things that I'm seeing. You've got to give me time for it to almost catch up with itself. And sometimes, I criticise films for having unnecessary bits of exposition dialogue to make it clear to the audience what's going on. But if there's a need for it, there is a need for it. A lot of these films do it even though they don't, because they're properly dumbing it down for a basic audience. This is a film that is great, but needs to let the audience know where they're standing, for them to properly understand what's going on. Because some of the motives don't make sense, and even by the end, just a little bit like, I'm not sure why they did that or where that plot line was actually going. And it looks and sounds great, and that will be enough to disguise what I would almost call the pitfalls for some people. But I think had this had a more critical eye, someone who really knows their story inside and out, because ultimately this director took on this story that isn't entirely their own. It's not like they've written this all by themselves. If they'd had that really critical edge, this could have been so sick. But something just doesn't sit right for me, and it must be to do with that story and that absence of information afforded to the viewer.
So I'm gonna reference a couple of things now, and they are kind of spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film, I would recommend skipping ahead 30 seconds past what I'm about to say. But when they bring things in, like he gets saved by the kind of resistance, and they're talking about how they're going to kind of start this war. That happens, and then you've got half an hour, and it never gets mentioned again. Like, there's no continuity or continuation of that idea. Then you have 30 minutes of him having his kind of personal battle again, and it's the classic thing, and I don't understand why directors keep doing it, where you have this hero who can't die. Like, he gets stabbed, oh, but it's okay because he appears over there. He gets like choked, oh no, it's okay, he like outwits the person and is again alive. Like, if you're going to try and make them seem vulnerable, there has to be some kind of long-term vulnerability. You can't just have him, he's been stabbed, and then a minute later, oh, he's fine, he beats the person, he wins.
I think that's a good point.
That kind of stuff starts falling off, and you lose faith in watching this film for 2 3/4 hours.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. This has, for me, it had a bit of similarity to The Matrix last week that we watched, because the main character of the film is on this journey of either discovering that he is the savior or like deciding that he's the savior. Is this too far into spoiler realm?
That's vague enough. No. I think you're all right.
I think it's really nice how it. This is the kind of sad part. It's really nice how it ends in that it's quite unique in this way that this hero, he's a hero to what we've just seen, but in the big scheme of things, maybe he's not that important.
Yeah, and I think that's why you're right, Roy. Like, he could have actually died because he isn't the savior. Like, at the end of the day.
I think the film maybe gets a bit too big for its boots when it tries to talk about this revolution and all this stuff, because it's like, if the whole point is that he's not that important, why does this matter? Like, why are they even talking to him? He's on his own journey, and we can appreciate that. It looks beautiful. There's some great lines, but like, you don't need to kind of big it up that much.
Now, this is worth commenting on, because this film, whilst it's long, was originally, I think, around 4 hours, and they realised that they could actually cut it into 2 rough movies, and they did, and they realised they both looked like movies on their own, but he made an executive decision, the director I mean, to make it one film that all encompasses the storyline they went with. So I'm wondering if they had split it into 2, which I'm sort of surprised they didn't, to be honest. That seems like a sort of thing modern production studios would do to maximise profits, whatever. That might have given some more explanation as to where all of these subplots are going, because the one Rory mentioned, I won't say it again, you are exactly right. It's the same thing I thought was, where's that gone? When the credits start rolling, where has that actually ended up going? I couldn't work out if that had won, if they'd lost, if they got what they wanted, whatever. And it just, I don't know, it doesn't feel right. It just doesn't sit right. But maybe they are.
I think there's quite a few films. There's a lot of films in this genre, and I think rebooting it, I know it's a sequel, but it does feel like a reboot of Blade Runner. I think it's risky in the sense that these films were, even like The Matrix we were talking about, they're so innovative in their time that they look beautiful and you're like, wow, these are such new ideas, talking about how people relate to technology, how important it is. You can't make them in the exact same way. And you can't use, your plot can't be the exact same plot. And personally, Blade Runner 2049 doesn't reach the heights of some other films from way back, and if they've been rebooted, thinking stuff like Total Recall, The Fifth Element, Minority Report. I will say Total Recall's remake was terrible. With
it was.
Colin Farrell.
Colin Farrell, yeah.
But I think the originals of those were great, and I loved them for what they were at the time. And I'll go back and watch them. I don't need to see Ryan Gosling redoing it. But that doesn't discount the stuff we've said about the special effects, the stuff about the cinematography, the score. I think they're all fantastic.
Well, this is one thing I want to comment on, is that there is one scene in particular, Ryan Gosling's second baseline test. It's probably about halfway through the film. And I will genuinely say this is probably one of the best shot scenes of a film I've ever seen. It is amazing when you watch that 30-second period. When he's doing an acting technique called dropping in. It was his idea when he came up. Ryan Gosling's, where you essentially repeat phrases over and over again to induce a trance-like state. Don't know if that works for actors, but it is a technique they use. But if you look at the differences between the first and the second baseline test, they are so subtle, but they are so excellent if you really know what you're looking for. It'll be things like Ryan Gosling's character will gulp or take a split second longer to answer a question. Or it's even things like, it is literally a robot asking him questions. But as far as we're aware, isn't it? It's a microphone in the wall, Big Brother style. And there is a point where he says the line, how does it feel to be held by someone you love? But he says it like a split second slower, with like a slightly downward inflection on the final word. And it's actually amazing. But that's what it feels like to me. It's a collection of Denis Villeneuve spending a lot of time on specific scenes without looking at the big picture as to how this all works if you're to show it to a standard audience.
Yeah, and for everything that we've said, from a casual viewer point of view, and someone that hasn't seen the original film, I think it's important to reiterate that you can actually enjoy this film if you've not seen the first one, because I hadn't seen it at all and I didn't even look up plot points before. But that didn't, for me, it didn't detract from the baseline enjoyability of the film. But I would say that if you wanted to get maximum enjoyment out of watching it or fully understand what's going on, like Harry said, you kind of need to have a really good understanding of the lore and the film that came before it. And I think some of the moments in the film, they'd probably hit you a lot harder as well if you'd kind of knew that, because there's like the main character of the previous film. He, like Rory said, he's not in it for a lot, but I think it's quite a big impact element of the film when you kind of realise a few things surrounding his character. But for me, that just kind of completely missed because I had no knowledge or involvement from the previous film.
Have you guys seen Ex Machina?
Yeah.
So it deals with the very similar themes, and it would be interesting to talk about that maybe on a separate podcast. But I I mentioned it before, but one of my favourite parts of the film was the way it looked at those relationships between humans and AI. Even like a more developed AI with a less developed AI, essentially. But I think when it comes to kind of big messages we can get from the film, I think that's the thing it made me think about most.
Interesting.
As in, you were looking at it and thinking that you could see sort of deeper meanings to how the human and android, I'm going to call them android for the sake of argument, interactions work, or android to sort of lower android.
Well, I kind of qualified it that way because the main character isn't human, right?
Yeah.
But I think it makes you think about both, because obviously us as humans, that's how we would relate to it. But yeah, that was kind of the big, deeper meaning and message that I found in the film.
It's interesting because, well, we've almost done this with The Matrix as well. Like, coincidentally, it didn't even really occur to me when we thought of saying, let's watch Blade Runner. The way that Mr. Anderson reacts and the way that, sorry, not Mr. Anderson, the way that the main agent reacts in The Matrix and the way that Kay reacts are quite similar in that they are robots taking on a human likeness, and you can see the degrees of it through the film. And I love exploring that. And I wonder how long you've almost got left to explore that, because we've got to accept it as well. When that first Blade Runner came out, we're in the 80s. You are so far away from artificial intelligence on that level, it's not even conceivable in real life, really.
I mean, it was set 2 years ago, right?
Isn't it? How sad is that? The event is 2020 or 2019, isn't it? And we're now in 2049. And it's not an inconceivable notion that there will be artificial intelligence or humanoid replicants or whatever doing things on this level. So I think you've got to be so careful with how you address the balance, because people can conceive and naturally think of their own opinions of it now, that it's almost a difficult thing to portray on screen. But I still think Blade Runner does a really good job of it. Like, I still think it made me aware that I'm thinking of Agent K as a human, or I'm not thinking of every character that I see. Are you a human? Are you a replicant? Are you neither? Are you... and that is good, you know, in the same vein as District 9 makes you think about sort of hierarchies in society. It was the same thing I was thinking when I was watching Blade Runner.
How would you guys rate this film, kind of compared to some of the films we've already watched, and also kind of on its own?
I'll start. So I feel like I do this a lot. I give a ranking before we start talking about films, and then we talk about it for quite an in-depth conversation in quite a long period of time, and my ranking kind of changes. So I originally had this film kind of in the 8s. Again, like I kind of give ratings based on impact and things like that, rather than objectively looking at like specific elements of the film, which is more what we do in the podcast. But I think because, Harry, how you explained it, there's a lack of how much you can enjoy this film without like rewatching it a lot of times and fully understanding what every part of the plot means in the bigger picture. As like a first time viewer and someone that's not watched Blade Runner before, I feel like it brings the score down for me. So I'm gonna give it a 7.4.
You dropped half a point at least. Yeah, that's pretty large.
I mean, I really enjoyed it because like the music was so good. Well, the music was good. It was suspenseful, but we do kind of see it a similar style in a lot of films at the moment. But the visuals were like fantastic. I've not seen color and shadows used like that in a film recently, to be honest. But yeah, just the more I think about it, the more I feel like how much more would I have enjoyed that if I'd seen the first film? And is it the director's role or whoever's, in the whole production team? Is it their job to kind of explain that to new viewers more? Like, where does that responsibility lie? Is it me or is it them? I don't know. So I have to bring it down, and 7.4. What do you think, Harry?
I'm a bit higher than that. I think it's sort of around a 7.8, 7.9. I think it's the same phrase I'm going to use. Is that it's good? It's not great. I wanted it to be great, and it's everything that I should like. It's all my favorite, composers, cinematographers, actors, the ideal scenario set together, and the fact that I don't immediately love it tells me there's something inherently wrong with it. And I think it is down to, there's occasional bits as well that I don't love. There's a few clunky lines. Like there's a point where she says, "I hope you're fully satisfied with our product." I feel myself cringing. I'm like, that's not what you've set out to make with this film. There's a few scenes that don't make a ton of sense to me, and the plot. But for the bits that are good, they are so good that it brings it back up for me. As in, it's almost there. It just needed something a little bit extra to tip it over. So I'd say about a 7.8. I think that's where I'm at.
That's really interesting, Harry, because I think I have a very similar line of thought to you. But for me, like you said, there are scenes that are just 10 out of 10. And there are scenes that really bring it down and really make you question what you're watching. And for me, those lower end scenes brought it down for me. I would end up giving it something like a 7.1. I think I really hate the idea of a hero who can't be killed.
Yeah.
The idea of a hero who is just completely invulnerable, unless something like The Matrix, where the entire plot is that he is the one. He's like built in to break the system. And yeah, stuff like the length, stuff like those kind of elements that get brought in just to end up meaning nothing. They bring it down for me. It's annoying because so many aspects of this film are really unique, and and the cinematography is so good, score's so good, that I would have loved to have seen it a little bit more condensed. I think it is definitely worth watching in terms of just the visual experience. A lot of the themes brought up are really important. But yeah, it doesn't quite hit the heights for me.
I'm happy with a group rating around 7.5. I think that's fair. I think that addresses what we're saying. It's on the cusp. There could have been more, but I'd still watch it.
I also think Denis Villeneuve's made better films. I think in terms of comparing it with his other films, I think the fact that this is an already established franchise makes it harder to make a really good film. But I loved Prisoners so much. Arrival, I was a big fan of. Sicario, I feel like I need to watch again because I watched it quite a while ago. But yeah, I'm excited to see what he's going to do with Dune.
Sicario is interesting actually because that's almost a similar scenario to Blade Runner in that there are some scenes, the border scene near the start in Sicario, another 10 out of 10 scene, amazing. And it looks like he can construct a scene brilliantly. But the overall product just doesn't quite get there. Yeah, even though it's, again, everything I should love, it just doesn't quite meet it. I don't know. Yeah, Dune will be interesting.
On a lighter note, guys, how many sets of boobs did we see in this film? Like...
Mate,
we didn't even talk about costume design.
Podcast.
Costume design was awesome in this film. I think I loved when it comes to the setting, when it comes to Blade Runner as a universe, I loved what they did with the costumes, the characters, a lot of like the visuals, not in terms of how it's shot, but in terms of the like set itself. Big fan of.
I mean, that's the thing. That's what almost annoys me even more, is a lot of care was put in. But it just doesn't feel like they went, what is the average person going to think if they didn't watch the first Blade Runner? And even if they did, they didn't, just quite like films. I don't know. Maybe I'm not the target audience. Who knows? Everyone online likes it.
Yeah, it's got good reviews online. I mean, I will say, like, my initial rating was, like, 8.4. Like, I did really enjoy the film, like, as immediately after I watched it, but...
We need to watch Dune as soon as it comes out, because that'll be when we come back to watch Dune when that comes out, and we'll be able to look back at this and say, did we see things similar to what he did in Blade Runner, or will we see? Because again, that is a sequel/remake on a massive scale.
When it's
similar style.
Will
we see the same things?
When is that?
I think that'll be
the
test. I think it's coming out 2022. I can't remember how long it actually got pushed back. Chances are my computer's not going to let me Google it, but it's not too far away, and that's, I'd argue, an even more hyped film than Blade Runner was.
For all the criticism I've given Blade Runner 2049, I really like the fact that Denis Villeneuve has been given the keys to Dune, because I think the books are massive, right? It's got like a massive following of people who love it as a series. And in terms of what he's done so far, I think it could be his defining piece. Obviously, it's probably going to be a series, right? There's loads to Dune.
I don't know.
Think it's going to be covered in this one film.
Is it not a standalone film?
I think there's multiple books, right? I'm not actually sure. But
I don't know what the
whether it's
original
one
was.
film or a series, I think if he hits the nail, if he hits it,
that's the
if
one.
he hits the nail on the head.
Exactly. But that's not even what I'm trying to say. If he gets it spot on, I think it'll be like his career-defining piece.
Yeah. I mean, he's up there at the moment as directors in Hollywood go, but this is him trying to jump it. You know, probably be the Scorsese, Tarantino-esque level, I think.
So that's been episode 4. And next week we're going to be watching and discussing a film called I Care a Lot, which stars Rosamund Pike, who you'll probably know best from her role in Gone Girl. So thanks to Rory and Harry, and we'll see you in the next episode.
See you in a bit.
Save the star.